Welcome, one and all. Welcome, Yael Eckstein, who's joining us live from Eretz Yisrael, from the state of Israel, from Medinat Yisrael, representing as the CEO and president of IFCJ, the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews. We gather at a time of gathering, a time of expressions of solidarity, as our sages of Israel teach us, Harbe Shluchim Lamakom. The Almighty has many various emissaries, and we're so honored that Yael is joining us. I'll welcome also her mother and extended family who are joining from Florida, and her bio should be well known to all of us. The most important salient feature is Yael grew up at Congregation or Torah, and we're so thrilled and honored that she's able to join us today. As I advertise it, we advertised in very short order, with many thanks to our Education Committee co-chair, Phil Greenland, who's with us, and our own Lori Simkovich, who's the VP of Finance for the organization, and all of you who are joining us today. And we will probably not have time for questions owing to the tight time frame, but hopefully we're about to hear, as I put in various letters and communications to our congregation the last 72 hours, from someone who knows and someone who's on the ground. And I was privileged to be there in 2010 in the Ukraine with the JUF, and to see how many unbelievable community centers and good works are being put into action thanks to IFCJ. So without further ado, with a great honor, present Yael Eckstein to give us a briefing from on the ground as things are unfolding in Israel and, of course, in the Ukraine. Over to you, Yael.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Engel. And it is such an honor to be back in my hometown, can you say that? With everyone, so many familiar faces. And unfortunately for a situation like this. The first thing I'll say is it is amazing to see Mika Amcha Yisrael, to see how the people of Israel and the extension of the people of Israel, Jewish people around the world, have come together in unity to stand with the Jewish community in Ukraine. I'll start back. I've been going to Ukraine for around 15 years. I started off going, of course, with my father, Rabbi Yael Eckstein of blessed memory. And not many people know that there are 200,000 Jews who live there, and the level of poverty that, Rabbi Engel, I know you saw when you were there as well, is something that we can't imagine. The Jewish community, along with so many of the Ukrainians, are living without running water in their home. They're living with wells in their backyard. They're Holocaust survivors who are growing their own vegetables in order to pickle and get through the winter as it is. That what this war has done now to the Jewish community is something that we'll be needing to care for, and we'll be seeing the long-term effects, I think, for probably my entire lifetime. What we've been seeing only in the past week is something that we're only now beginning to realize the extent of it. I was actually in Kiev around 2 weeks ago, just a few days before the war broke out, and I went to go see what was happening on the ground. Everyone was talking about the war that was going to break out and the preparation of the Jewish community. And I felt like the only way I would be able to really understand what the needs were and what was going on was to see it firsthand. And when I went and I traveled across all the different shuls, all the different synagogues, from Chabad to the different centers that JDC is supporting, that I know the Federation, of course, Chicago Federation is so involved in, I saw that everything was operating as normal. And in a way, that was the scariest thing for me. I would speak to the people who were living there and I'd say, "Are you prepared for war?" And they looked at me kind of like naive and over dramatic, and would say, "There's not going to be a war here. Maybe there'll be a small war in Eastern Ukraine. Maybe there'll be a little bit more Crimea. Well, maybe we'll see a little bit more of the Russians moving into Eastern Ukraine." But that has absolutely nothing to do with Kiev. And as soon as it starts, we'll get our plans together and leave. And it was after that trip, that only 2 weeks ago, but it feels like forever, that I came back to Israel and immediately said, we need two things to happen. Number one, the fellowship's giving an emergency preparation grant that is only going to be used to prepare for the war. All the communities, not only in Eastern Ukraine, in Kiev, in all the different Jewish communities, we're giving a $1 million grant to stock up on food, mattresses, and the basic items so that when war breaks out, if it does, God forbid, you'll be prepared. If not, you'll use the food for the next 6 months and everything will be fine. The second thing that happened was that we, at the fellowship, we contacted all of our partners. We have 7 different organizations that we work with on the ground in Ukraine. And we said, now is the time that we have to get together. We have to put our organizational ego on the side, and we have to all come together to save Jewish lives right now before it's too late. And what was amazing to see was that within 24 hours, for the first time ever in history, we had leaders of every single organization on the phone coordinating and coming up with emergency measures in the event of a war. It was a huge first step with the head of the Ministry of Aliyah and Klita, the head of the Foreign Ministry of Israel. We had many different government representatives, along with every senior representative of Jewish organizations, JDC, Chabad, Jewish Agency, Or Avner, Tikva, Shema Yisrael, and World Or. Those are the organizations on the ground in Ukraine right now. And everyone came together to highlight what their focus was, what they're able to provide if war breaks out, where they would need help, and really just solidify this commitment that in the event of a war, we were going to be together, working together side by side in order to help the Jewish community in Ukraine. And it wasn't more than 2 days later that war suddenly broke out. So I think at first what we all saw were that so many people stayed on the ground in Ukraine, and our focus was more on bringing basic needs to those centers. You had community centers, Jewish community centers and shuls that turned overnight into a safe haven for the community. So I was in touch with one group of shluchim in Kiev, Ina and Yonatan Markovitz, Chabad, and they had over 90 people staying in their 1-bedroom house with 1 bathroom, or it was 2 rooms, the living room and the bedroom, and 1 bathroom, but they were all together for Shabbat. So of course that's not sustainable. By the next day, they set up the synagogue, they set up the center of the school in order to be together in these locations. They let in non-Jewish Ukrainian neighbors who wanted a safe haven. But what we saw was that the first stage was providing basic needs on the ground in Ukraine. And once everything got so intense, what we had to do was to evacuate. And so now we're focused mostly on evacuation, refugees, and of course, Aliyah. So what we're seeing now from communities left behind, just some of the outcome of these partnerships with all the Jewish organizations coming together, that we meet once a week at least, and we have a WhatsApp group that we're talking all day, is that one example is that there was an orphanage in Odessa that left, and they opened up their mikvah to be used as a safe home for when bombs were falling. People there didn't have bomb shelters, and so the local community was using the mikvah because it had no windows to be protected from the bombs. They opened up, they had storage of food. There was another Jewish community that wasn't able to leave, mostly elderly Holocaust survivors, that were able to go into the orphanage, get all the food and distribute it to the Jewish community there. In Kiev, we actually have a fellowship worker on the ground now who her husband went out to war. She found out just a few hours later that she's pregnant, and she's still there coordinating all the efforts on the ground in Kiev for the fellowship along with our partners. But what we're seeing is Chabad says we have food in Kiev, but we don't have money. JDC says we have money, but that will bring to you, but we need food actually in Kharkiv. That will go and bring that. Chabad brings them food. What we're seeing in the level of coordination is the story that stands out to me the most out of everything. We're seeing the disaster and the hardship and people who are literally leaving overnight their family, their bank accounts, their houses, their cars, people who I was with 2 weeks ago who are functioning people who went out to work. We're seeing lawyers and doctors, all these things that you think that could never happen to me. And today I was at the airport greeting them on Aliyah, where all they brought with them were the clothing on their backs. And so I think what stands out the most when you see the faces on the borders now of those who are refugees and fled in the middle of the night with whatever they were able to bring with them. And today, when I welcomed 3 Aliyah flights to Israel of refugees, we have over 400 individuals landing today, including 100 orphans from an orphanage in Zhytomyr. What stands out to me the most is simply that they're like us. You know, you imagine refugees of the olden days of that it's so easy to disconnect when you think of World War II and you think of how easy it is to think they were different than us. Maybe they didn't plan ahead. They weren't as established. They didn't see the warning signs. So easy to disconnect when we hear about the history. When you look today, there's people crossing over the borders as refugees with their cell phones, with their iPhones, with their ear pods in, that they could be us. And I think that is, that's really what stands out to me so much. There are so many stories that we're hearing on the ground. This group of orphans that I've been following from the second they left fellowship-sponsored orphanage in Jitomer. It's a group of 100 orphans, and they left actually on a Friday. It's a very religious Haredi orphanage, and traveled all through Shabbat. They stopped in order to make Kiddush, got off the buses, and went back. Of course, Pikuach Nefesh, and told the kids, you know, on Shabbat, you normally it's a mitzvah to stop and to rest and to focus on the Shabbos. Today it's a mitzvah in order to get over the border and save our lives. They switched buses over 15 times. They were traveling for over 3 days. They crossed the border. They were put up in refugee centers there. That was partnership with the fellowship and JDC. All this operation was led by Chabad, and today we welcomed all 100 of those orphans in Israel. So I guess one of the stories that stood out to me so much was a girl named Chani. She was a little girl from this orphanage, and when I saw her today, she said, "Tell me about your journey." And she said, we had to leave within 2 hours. It was too dangerous to stay in Jitomer. And as I was leaving, I realized I'd forgotten Choo-Choo, my favorite toy monkey. So I ran back inside to grab Choo-Choo, and I held him the entire way here. And she was going down the stairs holding Choo-Choo, her little monkey. And so these are just, the stories are endless, and the people who you're seeing, the Holocaust survivors. For me, seeing the elderly today is the most heartbreaking, because, you know, most of these elderly have survived the Holocaust, have survived. Many of them came from Eastern Ukraine, that they survived the invasion in 2014, and to see them again needing to escape. So 2 Holocaust survivors, again, that I met today at the airport when they made Aliyah, was a woman named Zoya, she's 86-year-old, and Michael, who's 88. And they said to me, we're refugees for the 3rd time in our lives. In our childhood, we ran away from the Nazis. In 2014, we had to leave everything we had in our lives behind when the war started in Donetsk, where we lived. And we thought that Jitomer would be our last stop. And now we have to leave our home again. Our son's grave is in Ukraine, and I didn't even have a chance to say goodbye. So these people weren't prepared for this. No one was prepared for this. And when you see the people who are crossing the border, 98% being women and children, because from the age of 18 till I think it's 50 or 60, men aren't allowed to leave. And so you see in these refugee centers that the fellowship set up on the border with JDC across the border, women and children crying for their father, women worried about their husbands, and doing all of this alone, needing to escape, pack their bags, find a way to the border, which oftentimes took days, and to cross the border to so much unknown without any support. So we have a lot of, I think the past week has been a lot of just dealing with individual needs, wherever they came up. If there was a community that had to be evacuated in one city, we would go and evacuate them there. If there was a community that needed food, we'd find a way to get them food. If there was an elderly Holocaust survivor who needed medicine, find a way to get medicine. And now is the time where we're kind of shifting to longer term strategic plans and seeing where does that include the government of Israel. For example, we've gotten over 10,000 requests for Aliyah, and we expect for that to go up. Now, many of these people aren't necessarily eligible, and it makes it even harder when they come over the border with only their passport, if you're lucky. So we try to find their family members in Israel and get the papers from their family members. And if they have a family member in Israel who was eligible for the law of return, then we worked with the government to get that recognized, that they're able to just come to Israel without supplying their own documents. But there are so many of those people who aren't eligible. And there's a huge refugee crisis besides just the Jewish people who want to come to Israel, that now is the time, for example, that the government of Israel is going to come in a new way. And the role, I'll end with this, and then I'm not sure if we have time, Rabbi Engel, like maybe for one or two questions, but I look at the role of the nonprofit world to fill the gaps of what the government does. We're not there to take the place of the government. And it was inspiring to see how Israel sent, for example, lots of humanitarian aid to Ukraine. The Fellowship, JDC, Chabad, Jewish Agency, of course, through the federation system. And I know Chicago has one of the strongest federation systems, which is amazing to see that work in action. We're there in order to fill the gaps. And unfortunately, with this crisis, up until now, we have been the ones taking care of all this area of basic needs inside of Ukraine, of planning the evacuation, of getting them over the border. But I guess the reason why it's worked is what I said yesterday was the organizational ego is dead. We've come together in order to save lives. And that's, I guess, the light within all of it. Seeing the Olim who deplaned today, the 3 planes of Olim. This week we have hundreds more arriving, and standing there with all the different representatives of the government. Today the Prime Minister was there, the Minister of Finance, the Foreign Minister, of course, Minister of Aliyah and Klita, together with Becky Caspi from Federation, Yaakov, my good friend from Jewish Agency, and everyone just coming together in order to do whatever we can to help save as many lives as we can. So the biggest need right now, I would say, is evacuation, setting up more infrastructure on the border for refugees. Just today in Moldova, we had overflowing of Jews in our refugee centers that we had to set up 2 more in a matter of hours in coordination with the local Jewish community and of course the JDC. So, and then of course bringing them to Israel. So I don't yet have the long-term strategic plans that hopefully we'll have in the very near future, but right now it's a day-to-day war that we have just on the humanitarian side of saving lives.
Yael, thank you so much. This is an unbelievable report, even more than I think any of us bargained for in all the media that we've been exposed to, the stories that we hear. To hear you tell the story in such a personal way. With your permission, I'm going to make you a co-host of this meeting. And I'm going to invite anyone who would like to send in questions just to type them in via the chat. One actually came directly to me before you concluded your remarks. And I don't know if this is something you can comment on, but the question is, can you add anything about Prime Minister Bennett's recent whirlwind trip to Europe and about any peace negotiations? I'll add on to that question. I don't fully understand what exactly is being negotiated at this time. Like, I don't know if that's something you can comment on.
So I could tell you just kind of what people in Israel are saying. I don't have any inside information that you don't have from the news, but I could tell you kind of on the ground in Israel what people are saying. I think on one hand, people feel like it's an amazing opportunity in place that Israel's put in the spotlight to be able to bring peace. I mean, halavai sheniske, but that there's this possibility that Israel could bring peace, and I think that comes kind of on the heels of Israel, the people of Israel feeling both torn about Israel not taking a strong, bold stance against Russia, because of course, Russia's on our border. Russia's on our border in Syria and holds a lot of cards and keys regarding the potential Iran deal and keeping Israel safe in that way. So Israel's in a really hard position, and you feel it on the ground as far as heated discussions wherever you go. Should Israel take a more outward stance against Russia or not? And so the fact that Naftali Bennett was asked to go and speak to Putin and potentially bring some sort of agreement or understanding or new wisdom to the war, and potentially reach an agreement to something that showed that maybe it's important for some country to stay neutral, that both sides respect. But definitely the people in Israel are worried that Israel will be taken advantage of, will be threatened within this, will have certain, that there'll be ulterior motives besides using Israel to form a peace agreement that will put Israel in a much worse position than it's been in before. So I don't have any inside information, although I was with the Prime Minister just a few hours ago, but that's what people on the ground in Israel are feeling.
Thank you very much for that. And, we're obviously very concerned here. And just on Friday, I sent out to the shul again, a lot of different links, including, of course, IFCJ, for all of your amazing work that you continue to do. But a lot of people are asking, is there an opportunity or a need for volunteers on the ground in Poland, in Moldova, in Israel? You've been on the ground, your organizations like it for many, many years, and you know the landscape. What's your sense of it? Is that a help or is that a hindrance? Is the best thing to do to support financially and offer our tefillot, or are there other things that we could be doing here on the ground in Chicago, or potentially overseas?
It's a really good question. I think so far in Israel, there isn't necessarily a need for that. From what I've heard on the border with Ukraine, if someone has a certain skill, like if they're a nurse or a doctor or have a certain skill that they're able to contribute, there's no one, it's not an organized space there. So everyone has their own place and all the organizations are working in coordination, but no one's going to say, okay, you come to this meeting point. So it's a real kind of trek and maybe risk just getting on a plane and going. The chairman of our board is actually going tomorrow to Moldova. We have 8 staff members along the border of Ukraine and 4 staff members inside of Ukraine right now. If you have a skill and something to give, I think the border of Ukraine could be good. And if not, then yeah, the best way to help right now is definitely financially. And like I said, whether it's JDC or Federation and Jewish Agency or Chabad or the Fellowship, we're all working in coordination. And those financial gifts are what enable us, like today when we had to set up 2 more refugee centers in Moldova, that we were able in a second to make that decision and make it happen in a matter of hours.
So let me ask you along those lines. We're talking about people who are coming now to, in many cases, to Medinat Israel. They're refugees. Obviously, Israel excels at absorbing refugees. This is a massive influx in a very short period of time. What happens to them? They go to a Misrad Klita and they're sent to an apartment. They're put in a Ma'abarot. Where do they go physically? These 90 orphans. Where are they going to? Kfar Chabad? What happens?
It's a really good question. And the truth is, it's kind of a complicated answer. There are 3 different groups of people who are arriving in Israel right now. One are those who are eligible for Aliyah and already have all the documentation and come under the Misrad Aliyah V'Klita, the Ministry of Absorption and Aliyah. And for them, there's a full plan. And the fellowship is actually funding the first 3 months and emergency basic needs when they get here. So when they arrive, they're going to Misrad Klita. There are buildings set up and the government has found buildings. I just heard that KKL is actually opening up a few locations for the refugees. But if they're eligible for Aliyah and have already proven that and have all the paperwork, or a family member in Israel that they're able by association to be eligible for Aliyah, then they go to a Klita center, Mirkaz Klita, an absorption center. The fellowship is giving them around $800 in basic needs for right when they arrive, just for basic clothing and different things to get settled there. They have the first 3 months very, very fully funded, basically. And then there's going to be a plan by then to integrate them into society. That's the easiest group. That's the group that kind of there's a full plan and is taken care of. We know it's going to happen. The second group are those who might be eligible for Aliyah. They haven't decided yet if they want to make Aliyah. And so they come to Israel in order to finish their paperwork to see if they're eligible for Aliyah or not. And then they haven't decided yet if they want to make Aliyah. And then they might go over to America, or they might go over to Europe or somewhere else. They're not necessarily going to stay long term in Israel. And that's a little bit more complicated. There's not a full plan yet for those people, which is a big discussion area in Israel. And the third area are those that are refugees. I haven't checked this data, but Yael, the Minister of Interior, today said that there have been over 2,500 Ukrainians who have arrived in Israel since the beginning of the war. Only 10% of those are eligible for Aliyah under the law of return. And that makes Israel the country across Europe, besides the bordering countries with Ukraine, that has absorbed the most number of refugees, non-Aliyah, per capita than any other country. So there's still a lot. We're only in day 10 of the war, that there's still so many changing realities, so much policy that still needs to be created. And I think once that policy is created, we'll have a much better idea for those long-term needs and ramifications.
Yael, thank you so much. I know you have a very tight schedule. It's already nighttime there, and you've had a very busy day welcoming 3 planes, including the 90 orphans, et cetera. And on behalf of Congregation or Torah, thank you so much. Thank you for the amazing work that you do, that IFCJ continues to do, that was doing well before this crisis began to unfold. Hashem should be matzliach your derech and give you success. And we're going into the holiday now of Zman Kila Lakolhi, a time of assembly and a time of getting together in solidarity and in fellowship. And we thank you so much for all of your amazing work with that. I'm going to close our event now because we did want to hold to time and respectful of your time and everyone's time today. I'll just close with announcing that tentatively Chabad of Illinois is planning a gathering tomorrow night to also have like some kind of a report from someone who's in Ukraine presently, also for tefillot, et cetera. More details on that apparently forthcoming. I just got that word right now while we were sitting here that they were finalizing that. Thank you so much for your time, and wish everyone a Shavua Tov. It should be a month filled, as we say in Megillat Esther, LaYehudim Haita Ora V'Simcha V'Sason Vikar Kein Tia Lanu. Should be for us and for all people of goodwill around the world. Thank you so much to everyone, and I wish you Kol Tuv. Be well.
Thanks, Rabbi Engel.
Be well.